This is Isabel Sadurni, and this is Frame by Frame, a podcast introduction to the most influential and respected film professionals working in New York today, talking about their work on films that continue to make New York an essential center of the global film industry. In 1981, sound editor Maurice Schell, picture editor Peter Frank, and re-recording mixer Lee Dichter came together in making the film The Verdict. Directed by Sidney Lumet, the film was nominated for 5 Oscars.
I think that he brought the post-war documentary cinema verite idea to dramatic film. Sidney shot everywhere, and I think that paved the way for a lot of people to shoot in the city and use the energy of the city as part of the movie. It was quintessentially New York.
Frame by Frame is brought to you in partnership with Motion Picture Editors Guild and Post New York Alliance, because it's how you finish that counts. Our website is postnewyork.org, and we can be found on Twitter at @postny. Our host for today's session is Soundtrack. I asked Maurice, Peter, and Lee to talk about the evolution of New York filmmaking as they were coming up, and what made The Verdict such a quintessentially New York collaboration.
New York had never had, pre-Second World War, didn't have a feature production thing until starting in the late 50s into the 60s, it began to develop.
That's Peter Frank, who started as a sound editor on films such as Reds and Melvin and Howard. He continued as a picture editor working on Sidney Lumet's The Verdict and Daniel, and has since edited for television and other films such as Dirty Dancing and Cadillac Records.
A lot of it was just commercials and industrials, but then the documentaries started to develop.
That was big. When I started, documentaries were very big. Channel 13 at the time. And all the both men and women editors were, it was a different breed. They were politically conscious, socially conscious.
That's right.
And even being around them, like listening to them speak or the way they worked.
That's Maurice Schell, a sound editor for both documentary and fictional feature films with over 50 years in the industry. His credits include Sidney Lumet's Serpico, Francis Ford Coppola's Apocalypse Now, Bob Fosse's All That Jazz, Jonathan Demme's Melvin and Howard, and Brian De Palma's Scarface, in addition to working with directors such as Ron Howard, Spike Lee, Ula Grossbard, Lasse Hallström, and David Mamet.
Zena Voidow.
Yes,
she was Eisenstein's sister-in-law.
Sister-in-law. She was an editor.
She was an editor.
But she had done documentaries before.
Yeah. But there were many like that with long histories. Nick's
father, I was about to say that.
Sidney Myers was an editor and a director, and he directed several documentaries. One of them called The Quiet One.
The Quiet One,
which was not the John Wayne movie, but a movie about a young black boy who's taken away from his mother by social workers. His mother's a prostitute. He's taken away, and it stays with him, and he won't talk. There was Helen von Dongen, who did the Flaherty movies. There was Sidney Myers. This is going back that far.
Right.
But the dramatic film, starting in the late 50s into the 60s, it began to develop. And now when you get to The Verdict, where we were all involved, and Reds and all of these bigger films, then we had a full-blown dramatic... we had the people who had the talents for dramatic film, and we had the facilities for dramatic films. Sound One developed sound stages. We could do Foley's.
Well, Sound One started out as Image Sound.
Where Tommy worked.
It was like
Tommy Stone,
it was this, like I said, Biro. It was called Biro. It was Eddie Byer and this guy Hugh Robinson had 2 rooms up on the 7th floor. I remember that. That's where he cut Midnight Cowboy. Then Alicia Birnbaum bought this place. The 2 rooms. It was like the whole place was probably these 2 rooms there. And he set up a thing where he had sound effect library, and there was a little room for Foley's and ADR. It was really small. And we used to go there for transfers. Like I was working on a French Connection when we had to get a transfer of it dailies, one of the takes. And Tom Fleischer actually brought it back. He was working there as a runner or something at the time. He brought it back. We were working on 20th Century Fox over 10th Avenue. It started like that, and then he built it up on the 7th floor, and then he got a cutting room, another cutting, and then they built a mixing studio on the 7th floor with Mel Zellniker, who then came from Reeves, where Dick Voracek was working. And then, they extended the whole bunch of floors. It became Sound One.
There's a whole expansion.
Then you came over.
That happened. I came over, they had one mixing studio.
Right.
And then from that, Tommy joined 6 months later.
Yeah.
And the 2 of us, with Sound One and Alicia's experience, with editing, they took more floors on the building. Sound One, 1619 Broadway, and all of a sudden we had an explosion. We ended up like with Trans Audio combining with us 7 rooms.
Right.
Well, 1619 had 5, and there was 2 up at 54th Street that came in 10 years later. But
Before
Sound
that-
One was 1 mixing studio. So transfer rooms,
Yeah.
editing rooms, 1 mixing studio, and then I came over in 83, and boom.
Yeah, before that,
And
we were
Tommy
cut-
came in 84.
That's Lee Dichter, a re-recording mixer with over 50 years working in film. His early credits include Alan Pakula's Sophie's Choice, Woody Allen's Hannah and Her Sisters and Crimes and Misdemeanors, the Coen brothers' Miller's Crossing, and Ken Burns' The Civil War. Since then, he's worked with a range of directors, including Francis Ford Coppola, Mike Nichols, Brian De Palma, Robert Altman, John Singleton, and Errol Morris, to name but a few.
Before that, we're cutting at 1600 Broadway, which was across the street.
Right across the street.
That's where, a lot of the pictures were being cut. And we go across the street to Alicia's place, San Juan. At the time.
Alicia was making a living doing English language dubs of Israeli features.
It's true.
It was the only steady work he could get because there weren't that many
Yeah.
feature films, and
Right.
that needed those services here. But that's what kept that facility alive. And in fact, that's why we were able to develop that way, because
Yeah.
Alicia kept those facilities available.
Yes.
So when a director would say, well, what if I do it in New York? A lot of directors lived in New York. They preferred not to be in California.
Right.
So they wanted to work in New York, but they said, well, we don't have a good mixing studio. Well, there was one. We don't have a Foley studio. Well, it's not a great one, but we can work with it. And so then they said, okay, well, we'll try it. And then it worked.
Yeah, and he was instrumental in doing that. And part of it is, he had a sound library that he started with, but part of it is we, sound editors and people working in pictures, we would give him production sound that we were able to take from the production to give him for his library, or we went out and recorded location, we'd give it to him, a copy of that. So he built it up, and so it was a mutual thing.
And a very cooperative thing.
Very.
There was a spirit of cooperation in New York that I found didn't really exist in California, except in certain isolated areas.
I think that's another reason why this explosion happened in that time period, where you had the actors in New York, the New York stage, which didn't have in California.
Correct.
And you had the writers in New York. California does go, oh, let's get a New York writer. They come, well, they were here. So this all happened here at that time, and the film industry followed that.
Yeah.
And the directors wanted to live at home. They wanted to,
Right.
you cut a movie at 6 months, you want to be home. And the same thing, so the extension happened with finishing. They wanted to finish it here. California wanted to take it, finish it out there. And
also-
eventually the studios got built. Dick was the only place in town.
Yeah.
Actually, it was him and there's a fellow named Al Grimalio,
Oh, yeah.
who worked for Manhattan Sound. He passed away very young. And he did Pelham 1, 2, 3. I think he did a
Yeah,
bunch
I
of other
like that.
things. He was a very good mixer. But there was nobody else. So that's when Tommy and I filled the void. We were 20
Yeah.
years younger,
Yes.
25 years younger than Dick. And so we were just, starting our careers in feature films. I was a little later because there were commercials. And we had the facilities there, we had the talent there to do this. So
And the technology was
And
changing.
technology.
Yeah.
And you guys
Right.
were more conversant
That's
with the
right.
newer
Right,
stuff.
right. And we didn't have the California unions with that out there to fight against it. So something would come along, a new system, new technology. The business was small. We can go get it right away. We didn't have to go through the layers of the California industrial
Yeah.
complex out there.
And there was a difference in style.
Right.
In California, they often used 3 people on the mixing board. So someone would handle effects, someone would handle music, and then somebody else would do dialogue.
So they had
In New
like-
York, it was one guy doing it all.
Right.
And that appealed, I think, to New York directors. It was a personal control.
It was,
In a sense, the sound effects and sound on a movie is like a musical score. You're scoring the movie with the dialogue prominent, but all these other things go in reinforcement of it, to enhance it, to drive it, all kinds of things. So one vision of that was a different way of approaching it than
Yeah,
the California version.
sure. I mean, I could hear the balance of the sound effects, the music, and the dialogue, and I wouldn't have to, coordinate with the sound effects fellow to lower a tire screech or something. I could just do it with my pinky and just work it and then shape the sound the way, and get the constant feedback from everybody in the room. And it was a combined effort of all of us to make something that worked with the picture.
Yeah. They also had the directors themselves, maybe a handful of them, or 3 or 4, were friends. So they would come to their screening to, make a comment about, what do you think of my film? Sidney, and then there was Herb Gardner and
Arthur Penn.
Well, I remember seeing him on screen. Like Patty Chayefsky was, he's a writer, but
he wrote Network with
I'm saying,
Sidney.
So
but he was very prominent in that group. In
that
he's
group,
a
so
playwright.
they would
As a
all
person,
come
yeah.
and at the screening, and Fosse, and what do you think? What do you think? That kind of thing. In other words, in addition to their own the environment, they had friends who were other directors who they confided in and worked together with.
It was more collaborative New York effort to make good movies here.
It was kind of the way it was. Like you were taught by someone else, who was taught by someone else, who was taught by someone else, and so you got to learn the whole thing. Like, for instance, I was an apprentice on French Connection with Jerry Greenberg. Jerry Greenberg was assistant to Didi Allen, and so was Richie Marx. So then they went on to become editors of their own. In the beginning, there was this editor called Carl Lerner. Now, Carl Lerner was really the beginning in a way, because he came from California and placed himself in New York, and then Didi came out of him, and one thing led to another and another. And you had an apprenticeship, an assistant. You learned the craft from beginning to the end of the entire project. Like, let's say I'm using this as an example, but like on a French Connection, I'm standing behind Jerry Greenberg, okay? And then somebody suddenly said, "What do you think?" What do I think?
Sure.
What do I think? And he's standing there. You go, well, what do you think?
And so that's the beginning of it.
And that's the beginning. And you're forced into it like that. But you feel comfortable because they're watching, and they're not there to hurt you. It's like to push you along, to get the most out of you. Then you get to the mix with Lee, and then you learn other things. What you can do, what you can't do.
Yes.
What you can get away with, you get away with him a lot more than you will with Dvorak. But
in the editing. Yeah.
In the editing, yeah. So there's a variety, it's a constant learning experience, I think, anyway. Yeah.
It was interesting. So then I came with Sidney to mix The Verdict, having always mixed features with Dick Borasek, and had learned his style. Now, Dick Borasek was a truly brilliant mixer, but he just mixed. If something was wrong with the tracks, we sound editors ran in the back and fixed it by editing. We stepped in, started to work with Lee, and it was the exact opposite. Sidney would say, there's a little problem, blah, 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 we got to fix this. And he would say, okay, I got it, I'll fix it. Right. And he would work on the board.
You do it on the board. That was a revelation.
The first thing I had to do was say, wait, I can fix that much easier for you. Sometimes he could do it easier from the board, but sometimes I could go in the back and re-edit.
And also quicker.
The tracks to make it work.
And quicker, too, because, when you did it manually, it was a little different. He was able to do it so fast because of the commercial experience.
Right.
So he did very quick, and it was like a brave new world here. Like Peter says, it was like, oh my God. Before that, and I loved Dick Borasek. He was great. Yeah. He was great. But it was a different kind of approach.
Well, he was great, but he was also very critical. And if he heard a sound in a track that he didn't like, he'd flick the slider with his fingers so it was playing really loud and say, "What's that?"
Oh yeah.
And you'd say, "Oh, you don't need that," or "Wait a minute, I'll fix it." And you'd run in the back and fix it.
Yeah. So Lee did it on the board. He just boom, boom, boom. It was gone.
Yeah.
Well, two reasons. One reason is, first of all, I was when I was young, I learned how to play piano. So my hands, I have very fast hands with that. But secondly, as Peter and Maurice mentioned, I had started on commercials. Well, with commercials, they would book like a half an hour with a half bumper. You had to do a commercial mix, a 30-second commercial, in a half an hour. And I really learned how to go fast. I was also learning from the crews that had been working on prior films, because I was new to the feature film area. Maybe I was doing some films 3-4 years before The Verdict. Four Friends was one of them, with Barry Malcolm,
Barry.
Right, Balky, and Arthur Penn directed. So I was learning what they had learned on the feature side. So I coordinated that into what I had learned from my background on commercials.
Right.
So I was really bringing something new to the table, and they were bringing something new to my table. So I was learning that part of it, the feature film part, is looking at something which I had always dreamed of doing something longer than 60 seconds.
In New York, you couldn't specialize the way you could in the West Coast. On the West Coast, you could do just comedies. Situation, you could do or just feature films or just a certain kind of feature film or whatever. Here, if you didn't go every which way the jobs were, you wouldn't work. You could do a documentary, then you could do commercials, then you could do a feature, you could do an industrial, and I did all of those things.
Right.
And Sidney liked that in people who worked with him. He wanted them to be broad that way, and he used that as part of his, what he actually called a New York point of view in his films.
Well, we all did that. You did documentaries all the way through, and I did documentaries all the way through. If I had some openings in the feature film, I'd be doing a documentary. I started with, I did Ken Burns' first film called Brooklyn Bridge, way back in the 80s. And I stayed with him all along until, I started getting too involved with the features. But I did a whole slew of his stuff, including Civil War and jazz. And each different type of film that we worked on presented different problems. Documentaries, you only get one chance to record it. You can't go back and take two on a doc. So there were many different kind of sound problems that we'd have to live with and figure out and create different ways to fix it. There was no book. We were writing the book as we went along.
Right. Yeah, and Sidney loved that. And Sidney used all those techniques. I mean, Serpico, Prince of the City, he used documentary techniques. The camera moves in that way. It bounces sometimes. And that's quite deliberate. He wasn't scared to pick up the camera and hold it, have it be handheld. Right. I mean, the thing where Newman breaks up his office, that was one 10-minute take, and the camera was handheld. And
also what the feeling was when you handheld the camera. You were there. You were part of the action because the camera's moving. You're just feeling it. So he instinctively knew that. He learned that from doing it.
I think that he brought the post-war documentary cinema verite idea to bigger feature films, to dramatic film, and I think he also brought the whole left-wing stage movement, I think, with Actors Studio, and it was a specific amalgam of those things, But he was quintessentially New York, very much so.
Yeah, right.
And I think even the other directors were influenced by him.
I think
Mamet for sure, strongly for Mamet. Yeah. Practically studied with him, in that sense. But I think also Jonathan Demme, and I bet you'd find it in Woody Allen if sure. In the way they're shot at least, even though that's a very idiosyncratic style verbally,
right.
And Marty, certainly in the New York movies of Marty's. I mean,
the early ones.
Yeah, the early ones. You know.
Well, Taxi Driver.
Yeah, Taxi Driver for sure. Yeah. Or the one about the Jake LaMotta.
Right.
Raging Bull.
Raging Bull. I mean,
Goodfellas.
Which are quintessentially. Yeah. And even the French Connection.
Yeah.
Shooting on the street, shooting on location in New York City instead of a soundstage.
And getting out of the studio.
They didn't do that. They just didn't do that. It was too noisy. It was too difficult. You had to close down things and sort. Sidney shot everywhere. He shot everywhere. He got permission to shoot everywhere. He dealt with the city very, very openly, and I think that paved the way for a lot of people to shoot in the city and use the energy of the city as part of the movie. Prince of the City, totally shot on location. I don't know how many setups there were in that. There was god-awful, huge number of setups all over the city. Everything was shot in the city.
Well, Dog Day.
Dog Day. Shot all over.
Yeah. And also the same thing, he also loved to use the sounds of the city. He was talking about the bus, the subway, the streetcar, the garbage truck, and not using music to have the feeling. He wanted the sounds of the city. You take those films in California, half of the movie would be music.
Yeah.
They would just slap it on. I mean, that was...
And he hated a phony acting style. He loved that what used to be called the kitchen sink kind of acting, the Brando, all of those, Yulia Kazan, style acting. That was his idea of good acting.
Which came out of the theater, really.
That's right.
And that's where.
Yeah, the Dead End Kids.
Right.
He was asked to go with them, and he stayed in New York, and they became big movie stars. Hunt Hall and Leo Gorski and all of them, and he would have been one of them if he'd gone.
He was a child actor.
Yeah.
Oh, well,
they all were, but I mean, at that point, when they had made that hit, it was called the Dead End Kids, I think. It was on Broadway. Right. And then they got a chance to go west to make a movie of it, and he didn't go. Right. He decided he'd stay. And they went through the whole thing with Odets and feeling betrayed, and
But he didn't like to talk about. He didn't. I don't think he wanted to make reference to his films being political. They were, they were social, or
Right.
they had a social kind of. Political was not something he didn't want to.
Nope.
He didn't want to. He didn't want to
was
deal
afraid of
with
it.
Huh?
He was afraid of it.
He was afraid. Yeah.
He told me. He told me he was. He got word that Winchell was going to name him as a communist,
Really.
and he got really scared because that was curtains for a career. And he pulled some strings, and he got a meeting. And he said he went and saw Winchell, and Winchell greeted him, and some guy came in the room and looked at Sidney and said, "That's not him," and left the room.
Hmm.
And Winchell said, "It's really nice to meet you," and he left. But he said that was the single scariest moment in his entire life.
I bet.
And he was left wing, and he
Yeah.
had been a friend of
Yeah.
my dad's, and so. And I think after that, he decided, that's it. I'm not having anything to do with this. My social view is my social
Right,
view, but
that's it.
political is not
Right.
up.
Right.
Which matched the times. I mean, you couldn't. That's why my parents left the business because of politics. But just the idea that if you worked in film and you were of the left wing, if you were in the Communist Party, you would be blacklisted and couldn't work. My
Yeah.
parents did Candy Camera, the first year of Candy Camera, and then they realized it's television, and the networks are going to can everybody who has anything to do, and they were both members of the party, so that was that. Then they were out of the business.
I think that he felt as being a New Yorker, and he felt it in his being, all the time. It wasn't. The filmmaking becomes an extension of him, but he was very much a New Yorker, and right. I would say.
And he didn't insulate himself. He was married to a black woman. He lived on the edge of Harlem.
Right.
In a fancy brownstone, but he lived on the edge of Harlem. It was not a fancy neighborhood, and he never moved from there.
No.
He was part of it.
I asked Maurice, Lee, and Peter to talk about how The Verdict came together, how they met, and what the conversation was like going into the film.
Maurice and I met first on Missouri Breaks.
Yeah.
On the sound crew of Missouri Breaks. I was an assistant sound editor at that point, and so
we
was
both.
we both were.
Yeah.
I was in music school and trying to make enough money to get through music school.
Playing the cello.
Right.
You're a cellist.
Well, in fact, I became a picture editor through sound editing. I worked with Lumet as a sound editor. In fact, was trained by one of his editors, Bob Fitzstevens, as a sound editor, and then became a supervising sound editor on Prince of the City. I was supposed to go on to Reds as a sound editor, and Lumet asked Dee Dee Allen, the editor of Reds, along with a few people, to let me be his picture editor. And she said, not until he's finished Reds. So I did Reds as a sound editor and then went on to The Verdict. And at that point, Lee Dichter's name came up because Dick Voracek was not...
Right.
Wasn't available.
Right. Was not
In
available.
fact, a year earlier, he wasn't available for Death Trap. That's how I met Sidney.
Right.
When it came time to mix Death Trap, Dick Voracek, who was the top mixer in the city, and he had done many, most of Sidney's New York pictures. And Dick was on a project, maybe 3 or 4 together, and they couldn't get in. So there was the word to the grapevine was that it was this young mixer across town who was working in a commercial mixing studio, which is where I learned. I did not learn in the feature studio. So here I was doing commercials, working in this studio that my father owned, and I was doing some documentaries, and I was starting to branch into features, some small features, and there was the word out that Lee was pretty good. So Sidney's team had meetings and said, let's try Lee on Death Trap, and Sidney said, let's work with Lee on the second one, on The
Right.
Verdict, which was right after, maybe 6 months later.
Right.
Right. I met Sidney earlier, like on Serpico. I was an assistant to Eddie Beyer. He was one of the sound editors. It was Eddie Beyer, Bob Raitano, I think Richard Cirincione, and I think that was it. I started as a picture assistant, so I went back and forth, picture assistant, sound assistant, and like Peter said, after sound assistant, Sidney actually did that a lot with sound editors. He made them his picture editor a number of times. Actually, I never really told this story, but he asked me to do that too. but I got sick and I couldn't do it. But that was on Q&A. He said, "Would you like to be the picture editor?" And of course, I was scared because I had been sound all these years. But he did that all the time, with Jack Fitzstevens, with you, with
Andy
Munching,
yeah.
I asked Peter to talk about what the conversations were like in the edit room.
Well, he had a pretty clear idea for the verdict. He had a pretty clear idea of how it was going to go. Sidney worked like a jigsaw puzzle player. He figured out what shots, what angles he wanted to be in the finished cut before he shot it. And he had this worked out absolutely clearly in his head. So, when he went to shoot the verdict, they took off the back wall, and they shot every shot that had to be from the back of the wall for every scene. Then they put the back wall on, took the right wall off, shot that way, left wall, and over the judge. So this incredible jigsaw puzzle, And at one point, we were watching the dailies. It wasn't for the courtroom scene, but it was for one of the lawyers' scenes. Mm-hmm. And we were looking at the dailies, and I'm sitting there taking notes, and we're watching the dailies. And all of a sudden, Sidney looks at me and said, "I fucked up." I said, "What?" He said, "You can't go from there to there. You got to go from here to there. And I didn't get that angle. We've got to pick it up tomorrow." And he turned to his assistant Bert and said, "Bert, we got to shoot that scene again. Don't let him strike the set." In his head, he realized it would break the angle. It would have screwed things up. You would have gotten discombobulated. We had to be over here to go there for that line, and he knew.
He's cutting in his head.
He was cutting in his head. And when we worked with him on films like The Verdict, we essentially assembled the cut that was in his head, right? With our own skills. I mean, any editor was working with our own skills. Only when it didn't work did we go into conventional editing, where you try to solve the problem, you look at it, you see if it's solved. It's not solved, you take it apart, you try a different way to solve the problem. We did that on Daniel. On Daniel, it didn't work. We looked at the movie and it was terrible. Nobody would stand to watch it. So then we had to rip the whole thing apart and rejigger it. And now I think it starts with scene 69, and it's, then it goes to scene 12, then it goes to scene 38. It's completely different from the script. And that was worked over, it took 6 months. The Verdict took 2.5 weeks to cut.
Wow.
Yeah.
Are you kidding me?
Yeah.
2.5 weeks?
Right. We just sat there, and Sidney told us which shots, and we handed him the shots, and we marked them out, and we spliced them together, and there was the verdict.
It took longer to mix it than to cut it.
Yeah, and we screened it, and he said, "There's one little thing I want to do," and we went back and we made this one little change. He said, "Okay, that's it. Go home, take a rest. We'll put it out to sound. I let it sit for a minute, but we'll probably go right out to sound," and that was that.
Same thing with sound. When we're in the mix, if he heard something he didn't like, all of a sudden he would just what's that? Look, take that out. He wouldn't like, "Gee, what do you think about that one?" He says, "No, take that out."
Yeah.
Just like that.
Yeah, he
wouldn't say why this and that. He said it plays better without it. Just take it out.
And of course, Sidney was excellent at that because he didn't vacillate over it.
Sidney was quick.
All he wanted was the job done.
He wanted the job done,
yeah.
and well done. But he wasn't into the meticulousness of everything.
He was death on indulgent altogether. Things had to be pretty straight. And with Mamet's dialogue,
right, that
was already written to be that way.
Right.
And that was one of the reasons I think he loved Mamet's writing, because it's very stripped down and unromantic and unpurple prose, but definitely his style was to keep it absolutely severe. Now, those decisions happened all the time. I mean, he was constantly saying yes, no, no. You're improving it into the shithouses. Is the example I ran into.
You're improving it into the shithouse.
In other words, you've added too much detail. We need it stripped down. We need it hard and lean within the story. Now, I didn't make story decisions very often, so I didn't run into that as much as writers would. I mean, I remember on a lot of things. The length of the shots, he sometimes marked with a grease pencil on the moviola. We would run it. He'd mark it in and out. Sometimes he would leave it to me, to time. He would say, "Give me 4 close-ups, equal length." So he would go boom, 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 right? And I would do that, and we would look at it, and if it was right, it was right. If it wasn't, we would adjust, But it was a place to start from,
But he would feel it, mark it.
Sometimes, yes. He did that less on other films, but on The Verdict he did it a lot. You know? Yeah. Sidney had a real sense of that tactile speed of the film through the gate that he could market. And then he, the only thing I think that sold him on working digitally later was that it was so fast. And Sidney was always about fast. So he just liked that it was fast, The other thing about Sidney with working with people is Sidney didn't want you to be a person. He wanted you to be an extension of his hands, right? An intelligent extension of his hands. And if he felt too close to you, that made it uncomfortable for him. Personally, too close. In fact, I think that's what happened with me. He we had similar backgrounds, similar political backgrounds. My parents were left-wing, as his were, and came out of New York, same as my mother was in the film business. In fact, my mother taught Jack Fitzstevens, who was the sound editor that taught me sound editing on Sidney Lumet's films. Jack Fitzstevens is the man who did the sound editing on the Pawnbroker.
Right.
When he's having the flashback to the prison camps and you hear the screaming and stuff, Jack Fitzstevens brought that sound to Sidney and said, Sidney, don't play it silent the way you are. Put this in too. You need it. And Sidney said, you're right, and did it. I mean, Jack was a very
And that was
creative
a hallmark in psychological flashback,
Yeah.
too.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And Jack was a real creative partner in that. And then later Sidney made him on Death Trap. He was a picture editor.
Picture.
And
Yeah.
just tell me what you want, I think.
I
He
don't
was
remember.
a picture editor also. That's when I learned
Yeah.
to be sound editor. Yeah. So
Yeah,
it was a long line, but he didn't want to be close, and because we had such a close background, eventually he hired my assistant, Andy, to be his next editor, and actually introduced me to John Cassavetes as a way of finding me more work. Because he was uncomfortable with that kind of closeness. He just wasn't that kind of a guy. Whereas with Lee, he met him only when he went to do the mix. So that was okay,
Right,
and
it was okay. It was only there for like 3 weeks.
Right, that
And
was
I
enough
don't
distance.
he really didn't say, gee, Lee, try that, see something, Try that. He didn't know. He said, this is what I want. Do it that way. Sidney had in his head how the picture was going to look and how it was going to sound. He didn't come unprepared to the mix. He knew what he wanted. And you had run the sound before, in the editing process, what we were going to do, what Maurice was going to try to put in there, and some of the sounds they're going to put behind the scenes. So when he got to the mix, he was pretty familiar with what was going to go in.
Yeah.
So he just had to decide on how much and how loud, and maybe take some things out that he wasn't sure of. But he was pretty sure how that movie was going to sound in his own head. So it was pretty clean. And
Well, Sidney believed in dialogue, and he always made sure you heard the dialogue, but he was a filmmaker who would tell you the story with pictures, too. And the Verdict is a prime example. There's a moment when you see a long shot, and you see Paul walking down the thing, and you see Warden come running up behind him and say something to him.
well, he's going to tell him that she betrayed him.
But you don't hear it.
You don't hear a word.
hear it.
And suddenly you see him go running.
In fact, there's
In
a
a panic.
there's a huge
Whole
no-
thing is told.
no
so
music.
all that dialogue is missing.
And sound effects, the street,
Just sound.
engines, sirens,
No music,
just
right.
just loud.
Yeah.
I think it's the loudest sound effect section in the movie. Also, with the visualization of not having dialogue, very little dialogue, is when Paul character is at the hospital taking pictures of the patient
client.
who has
Yeah.
and he's taking Polaroids. And the Polaroids, they come out black, and you put them on thing, and you have to wait 60 seconds for the image to come up. And he's looking, ambulance chaser, he's looking for a payday, a couple $100,000, whatever, of the final thing. And there's no music. It's about a 2-minute scene. He's taking the pictures, and you see he starts to slow down when he's taking the pictures. He's starting to think what he's actually doing. He's taking a picture of this person who's comatose in the bed. And in the background, Maurice is, all he's got going is the breathing machine.
The breathing thing, yeah, the monitor.
That's it. There's no music.
The monitor, yeah.
There's no music. You don't hear any of the voices in the hospital as you hear that. And then you slowly see these images come to life on the bed. And that's the moment that Paul makes the switch and realizes he's not going to take the money. He's going to fight. He's going to fight the scene. And it's brilliant. It's done with no dialogue.
Yeah.
Long takes. And it runs like 2 minutes, that sequence. There may be one cut, maybe.
I remember when he comes home at night, very late or early in the morning, and it's all quiet. And I remember putting like a garbage truck outside, and it was so haunting, like it was quiet, and he was alone, and it added to the loneliness,
It also gave it the time of day.
He had a time of day.
A lot of other films would have had music there.
Yeah.
Really, I mean, I noticed from The Verdict there must have been 7 places where most directors there would be a 2-minute cue going over the cuts. That's it. He had maybe 3 cues in the movie. He went for realism. He didn't want to force the emotions. He said it's up on the screen. You don't have to put that layer of music in there. It ruins it.
I think I agree with that philosophy to begin with, because
It's harder.
It is harder, but it's more. It's not in your face trying to make a big point of whatever you're going to do. So I always liked it very much, and he knew exactly. He always had the focus on the right thing in the drama of the film, in my opinion.
That's interesting you say it that way, because there was a side of Sidney who wasn't quite sure he was as good as that, and he was fighting that fight to prove he was good at this, in as much as that was a side of him, not one you saw easily, but he was never comfortable in his brilliance, the way some people are. He fought for it.
That's true. He dismissed a lot of that. It's true.
He fought for it, and he was constantly trying to prove it, and he took the failures of the films, the commercial failures, very hard, even though partly because it scared him that he wouldn't work, and he desperately needed to work. He said once, he said something about he had another film coming up. And I said, "Oh my God, Sidney, 2 at once? That sounds like hell to me." And he said, "That's my idea of heaven."
Yeah, I remember he said, "You've got to make the deal for the next picture before the one you're working on opens."
That's the fear. That's the fear.
I think you got to do it because, you never know if bad reviews. You're gonna have trouble getting the next movie. He says you got to just keep it going. A lot of directors from the 60s and 70s started, doing their films, and they didn't make money. So you get 2 or 3 in a row that don't make money, you start to get in trouble. So we lived, the heyday was in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, I think, maybe even the early 90s too.
Yeah, they couldn't get the money. I mean, even Brian De Palma, who was doing quite well, but then he couldn't get money to make a film either. He had to go to Europe,
He used to say, "I do 1 film for myself, and the next 2 films I do for my reputation and for my budgets," meaning the bigger commercial successes could fuel the energy that would allow him to do films that the studios didn't prefer to do. Yeah, he wouldn't go to California unless he was desperate for the job. And up to the time I knew him, I don't think he had ever shot in California. Up to The Verdict or Daniel, he'd never shot in Hollywood. He was quintessentially New York.
This episode was produced by myself, Isabel Sadurni, and Ben Baker. The sound engineers for today's session were Kristen Katonia of Soundtrack and Nick Schenk of C5. Stay tuned for episode 5, featuring a conversation with Post Factory founder Alex Halpern and picture editor Angela Correo, as well as episode 6, a conversation between Sound One founder Alicia Birnbaum and people such as Mel Zelniker, Tom Fleischman, Lee Dichter, and Jay Rubin, talking about the era of Sound One and the indelible mark it made in shaping the New York film industry. In New York, this is Isabel Sadurni, and this is Frame by Frame.